out from under people, so they sort of don't have a choice but to go to cloud. So we're literally, in fact, I think just the other week we put some of our first basic workloads in the cloud, just from that basic sort of platform perspective. But I will tell you, by FY20, we're going to move some very significant elements of our enterprise architecture and our enterprise footprint into the cloud. Now, we're not going to move everything there because, again, we've got some things that need to stay on-prem. We've got some legacy things that we don't need to move to something new, and it doesn't make sense to just rip them and move them. So we may move them to commercial data centers or things like that. And again, I want to prioritize. What are the things that bring a value to my customer? What are the things that improve my security? Where do I get where do I get economic value? We're trying to really be a little bit thoughtful about that rather than just sort of rip it all and go. And by the way, there are people who have done rip it and go that's worked very well, so I don't want to diminish that. That is a pretty valid strategy for some people who've had success doing it. We want to take a little more time just because we've got some interdependencies and some things that we don't even know have a full visibility about. So we want to be a little more thoughtful about that. We're working on some policies, again, not just for what I'll call our federal enterprise, but even for our sites. Not just our labs, we have environmental sites and other things that, again, heavily dependent on contractors. We're trying to put some guidance out to them so that they can make risk-based decisions about when and how to move to cloud, right? I don't want to do it by fiat. I don't want to micromanage, from the headquarters out to the field. I want to give them a framework, a comfortable framework to let them make risk-based decisions based on their context. And so that's how we're trying to move there. So I will be honest, I don't have a percentage because we don't have a good enough feel around how big the universe is. But what I do know is that we're moving a lot of ours dramatically there. And then the good news is I'm trying to accelerate our friends in the labs and other places. We have the labs for a reason. We want them to be innovating all the time. I want them moving to the cloud faster than me. I want them to move into all sorts of new things much faster than I can with federal restrictions that I have on me. And so we're really trying to push them to be leaders. And then all I ask them in return is that they simply tell me what they've done so I can claim credit for it.
That's excellent, thank you. Also, a follow-on question to that is, when you see the large portion of the enterprise moving to cloud in 2020, what percentage do you feel, from your perspective, should be cloud only, should be hybrid cloud, and should remain on-premise?
We're still breaking that down. I think there are models for each one. I am and have been for a long time a pretty big proponent for cloud for a lot of things. I think primarily, as you can imagine, some of the work we do just from a security perspective, there is a value of having the extra layers of defense that we can put, having it on-prem, that we will keep some stuff like that on-prem. And then we've got some areas, because of some of the work we do, we will have some that's hybrid, simply because we need to have that sort of extra level of resiliency. And that's really going to be the driver there. And again, I don't have enough of a picture to be on, to even give you a sort of a spitball shot of what those percentages will be. But I know that we're in a position where we have those use cases. And again, I think that's really important is not to arbitrarily choose one model or the other. It's really got to be driven by mission and business case. And so and again, we're on the beginning of just the business cases, let alone the actual moves. So we got a good amount of work to do there.
Thank you, Max. Very good. Perfect.
Max, I think it was May, OMB put out a report around the cybersecurity posture of the government agencies, and it was a pretty sobering report. I mean, it was like, wow, we don't seem to be making real progress. So we talk about it, and I think things like the President Trump's cybersecurity executive order was spot on. But maybe if you could comment, you got real expertise and background in cybersecurity. From your perspective, whether it be just from DOE or maybe even more general, are we headed in the right direction, or what would you like to see different that could really start to change that dynamic so we could really start to improve from a cybersecurity posture?
So I do believe we're on the right direction. I've seen progress, and I tend to be a bit of a skeptic on these things in my 18 years in DC. We are moving in the right direction in a couple areas, which is good. I don't think they're uniform enough. So I think there's a couple issues. I think one of the things I've been focused on is moving from compliance to risk, right? And what I mean by that is, look, compliance doesn't go away, right? At a certain point, you have to have compliance so we can do basic audits and assessments and validation, which frankly are a good part. We got to check our work. We got to have somebody watching the watchers. So that's never going to go away. But I think our management and decision-making process has to be driven by risk. And I think that's so critical to success, because if we go by the compliance model, what it means is we're going to take a snapshot in time and say, these are the 10 most important things we can do today. And then we're going to start going down that path. And all of us have been around government, so we know how that works. These are the 10 things we have to do, and here's the money to do them, go do them. And we'll get about 6 months in, right, and probably not even that given cybersecurity, and practically speaking, 2 or 3 of those things in the list will change. One of them may go away, and 2 other things may go to the top of the list. But we're government. We don't do that. We don't do change. We got to wait till the next, we have to wait till the next budget cycle for that, right? You go talk to, well, what do you mean? The money's programmed for this. We have to go do this program. That's oftentimes how we do things in government, unfortunately, right? I mean, it's the nature of the beast. And so that's one of those critical problems in my mind is there's some bureaucratic and other issues we have, but one of those issues is we've got to change a little bit of how we structure, how we do cybersecurity in government. We have to have the level of agility that our adversaries have. And so that's going to take real structural change in acquisition, in budget, right? In a couple of areas that, we got to spend a lot more time. It's not a technical problem, right? And again, bad things are going to happen, right? Risk doesn't go away. We can mitigate risk, we can buy down risk, we can transfer risk. Risk never goes away. But, when you look at that report, the huge number of departments, including mine, that are listed at risk, and that's frankly a very appropriate score. I don't make any bones about that. That's an accurate statement for most of us in government, is we are at risk. We have significant gaps in how we're protecting ourselves. And the long-term answer, the sustainable answer is that we're going to have to make some of those real hard changes in, again, a lot of that's in budget and acquisition. Because if we don't do that, again, we're going to go down the compliance road. And again, that's not just in cyber. We've all seen that in government, right? These zombie programs that go on and on and on, and everybody involved, feds, contractors, everybody knows that they're not making progress. We're not getting value out of them. But it's what we're supposed to do, so we keep doing it. And so we're trying to break some of that at DOE, right? I'm going through, you can say a prayer for my team. I've been going through a grinder with them on going through our 19 budget, right? I mean, I'll give you an honest example. I started in July of 17. So the budget that I have, my FY19 budget, is not really my budget, right? That budget was made before I got there. Because of the nature of the budget cycle, it wasn't my budget. I got a little extra money because my secretary and deputy secretary went to the plate to get me a little extra money. Not what I needed, but they got me some extra money. And they're committed that once I go through and really do the due diligence, if I find gaps, they're committed to help me find more funding one way or another to do it, right? I'll do a bake sale on Independence Avenue if I have to get more money. That's supposed to be my job. My team's job is to tell me what they need, my labs and everybody, and then my job is by hook or crook to get that money one way or another. But that, to me, honestly, I think that's probably one of the most key reasons that you see some of that lack of change is that we simply don't have enough agility in how we're doing those. And I see that even when I work with our national labs, right? If you don't understand our lab model, our labs are run by contractors. It's the government-owned, commercially operated. Now, that brings us some value because we can bring in some private sector expertise and capability and some flexibility that we don't normally associate with federal government. But it also means they're a contractor, and like all of us as contractors, you want to get paid for the work you do. So when I come in with sort of a new cybersecurity requirement, it's usually looked at, well, I'm pulling money out of their pocket. I'm pulling money out of the mission, out of science. Now, there's a risk managed way to do that, and that's what we're working on is how do we understand and have visibility on that risk process? Because I'm absolutely convinced that's the right way for us to do it as a department, but I have to have enough visibility, and my secretary has to have visibility to know what are the risks that we still have, and if there are common gaps, if there are systemic gaps, then we need to address them. We can't just let them lie. We've got to go one way or another find the resources for those. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to approach that. But again, with my labs, is I talked to some of them just a couple of weeks ago with the deputy secretary because cyber is moving too fast for us to wait for contract processes, right? I can do a contract direction change with them, but it takes an extraordinary amount of time, and then I have to do it for every one of them. that's not really, that's not a great model for cybersecurity, right? Not in the day and age we live in. And so we've got to find ways to increase the agility within the structures we have, or we got to completely change the structures. But that's the only way we're going to make long-term progress, right? We've made progress, like MFA is a good example. We made a big sort of burst of progress, and that was great news. As somebody who did some private sector cybersecurity for a couple of years, every company I got called in for incident response for, they didn't have MFA in place, right? It's just that simple. You know, MFA was a great step forward for the entire government, right? I don't think we as a community and government give enough credit for how important that change was. Now, we got to do the next step because most of us are just doing MFA on login. Well, that's great, but if you're like me, you're logging in and then you got 5 other different logins in the environment that are still just username and password. So now we've got to push MFA to all those legacy systems, right? How do you put MFA on a mainframe? That's a trick question, but that's the stuff we got to go start to do now is how do we push that in through the entire environment? And so there's a lot of those areas that we're doing. Now, having said all that, I think there's a couple areas that are a little disconcerting to me there's some basic block and tackling that we're not getting done in government too. You know, vulnerability management, patch management. Of course, and again, we know some of our private sector friends are having a little trouble with that as well. So I don't think that's unique to government. But that's got to be a risk-driven conversation, right? And so, and again, a big conversation, you know, having spent some time in private sector, working with private sector companies, I know very well that a lot of the answer to that is we have to talk in the language of risk. Unfortunately, in government, we don't have profit and loss to measure things. So we don't have one of those sticks, but risk is the language we can talk, right? Because that's what everybody in industry talks. If you talk to a board of directors, they want to talk in terms of risk to the mission. And so we at least have that. And so to the degree that we can measure that better, I think that will drive some acceleration of change. I'm certainly glad that we've got some folks on the Hill who I think we all know take this very seriously. You know, certainly the House Government Oversight Committee, I've testified before them twice. I know, you know, Congressman Conley, Congressman Hurd, Congressman Kelly, they take this very seriously. There's a whole, you know, there's a lot of groups and folks up there. You know, I can tell you our committee, you know, in the House and Senate take our work in the sector very seriously as well. So there are people on the Hill who I think take this very seriously and are trying to push us all in the right direction. But I know we've got some work to do.
Do we have any other questions? One short one?
Sure, pretty short question. You know, what percentage of your department's budget on a direct IT spend do you think is just inadvertently kind of walking out the door? I know it's hard to quantify, but
Yeah. So it's, you know, so we're working to, so I think our cross-cut for our IT spend, I think, as a department, so we're about a $30 billion budget, and I think our reporting this year we're a little over $2 billion in total IT spend. And then there's these cross-cuts for cybersecurity. You know, and so to be honest, I couldn't tell you. We're working on some of that, and so I'm trying to triangulate on that. Again, you know, I want to be, you know, before anybody gets dollar signs in your eyes, I don't direct all $2 billion of those dollars. So before you go too far on that, so a lot of that goes through our labs and other things, and exactly to your point, one of the things we're trying to do is understand, one of your questions I think is in there is, where's there duplication? Because we know there's duplication. And so I'm trying to triangulate, and what I mean by that is, I look at a couple different flows. So there's the budget, right? On one end there's the budget. There's the federal budget, and then we all have sort of these internal budgets. Now, how well we keep to those and where we hide things is a whole nother thing that all of you who've been around federal government know very well. Then we've got on the back end, we got the procurement process where we're tracking things. Well, that's a whole nother series of stuff, right? And then sort of in between, you've got how all that money sort of gets moved around and the viscosity of the money within the system. So I'm trying to sort of start lining all those up under FITARA, right? And using FITARA as a tool to start to line those up, because what should be happening is I start with a budget. Hopefully I'm being dynamic, and I might have to make some changes to that budget over the year as priorities change. No problem. I should be lining that up the entire time. I should watch where the money flows, and then I should see that coming out the other end of procurement and be able to track that the money that I said I'm doing up here for this purpose is going out over here in procurement. And I know you're not shocked to hear that doesn't always happen. And so we're working actually very closely with our procurement shop to start doing a lot better tagging of that money coming out on the back end. and then start to do a little more of a strategic view of, okay, we're spending all this money. What are we getting for it? What's our bang for the buck? Where's your duplication? Again, my department's got very diverse needs. When you look at some of those mission sites, a science office that's basically a giant user facility, excuse me, they look completely different from just my federal commodity IT. And so understanding their context is always going to be different, and that's fine. But they still have some back office stuff just like I do. And so there's some of that stuff that we should just be on a pretty uniform platform. And so, but again, then I put on my customer service hat. I have two options. I can try and use Fatara as this giant stick and say, everybody's going to go on this system. I know some people have tried that, and here's what's happened to them. If they didn't deliver customer service, then everybody came out with the pitchforks and torches, right? So that only works, again, this is that the credibility is capability. If I can go deliver on a few things well with proper customer service, and I can tell people their cost models, then there's not much argument left, right? Then if I go into those offices and say, well, you're doing email and it's costing you twice as much per mailbox as it is for me to do it, why are you in that business? So that's how we're trying to approach it, is start to line up, to your point, understand where all those costs are. And then in Fatara, when people come into me and ask a question, I want to know, all right, show me your business case, right? And that's what we didn't, that's where the great thing about the TMF model, because that's what, in private sector, look, if you go to your CEO, you go to your board and say, hey, we want to go make a capital investment. We want to go buy this new thing. They're going to be, hey, that sounds great. What are we getting out of it, right? And if you walk in there and you don't have a return on investment over time, if you don't show a cost deferral, if you don't show a new capability for your customers, you're lucky if they just throw you out of the room, if not out of the company, right? So kind of should be how we look at it in a government. If I come in with a new proposal, I ought to be able to show I'm either adding capability or I'm putting off a cost somewhere and putting it back in some other part of the mission, right? And again, this isn't those sort of arbitrary cost